Okay, so this is 522. It is October 29th. And today we're going to talk about factor analysis and then move our way into talking about path analysis and structural equation modeling a little bit, which structural equation modeling can be seen as an extension of factor analysis as well as regression. And path analysis is pretty much an extension of the regression framework. So what we've been developing in the course so far over time has been this idea of observed, okay, observed and latent variables, right? So we've had observed and the idea of latent variables. And we've developed these concepts from the start of the course pretty much. So I remember when we were reading stuff in Bolin featuring the ideas of latent variables, we were saying that these variables are unobservable. Okay, so they're unobservable, whereas the observed variables are, of course, observable. So sometimes the observed variables are called manifest and compared to this idea of latent variables. Now, this distinction here between observed and latent, we've talked a little bit about this, that it really gets kind of fuzzy, okay, as to what a latent variable is and what an observed variable is. If we really talk about this distinction a lot and really break it down, we would probably have to decide that all variables are pretty much latent when you really get down to it. And again, what do we mean by that? We mean things like, even if you measure your height or your weight, okay, even if you measure your height or your weight, well, classical measurement theory tells us that you're never going to know your actual true score for height. You're never going to actually know your true score for weight. You're going to get measurements of them. So if these are true scores for height and weight, and I get a measurement M of these, I'm using the measurement to get a picture of what these things are, right? So I'm getting kind of like an approximation of what these true scores are. So when I measure your height, okay, I get a measurement for that, I'm going to have measurement error, right? I'm going to have measurement error. It's not going to be a perfect representation of your height. Okay, it's not going to be perfect. So one way we can think about the latent variables is that really height is unobservable. Okay, height is actually an unobservable latent variable. Now, that's kind of really extreme because usually we wouldn't think of it that way. We would think of height, well, I can measure your height. Look, I'll take the ruler or the measuring stick and I'll just measure your height. We would think of it as unobservable. But it's helpful to think of it like that for a second, because then you can see that if all variables are latent, then what this means is some are just more easily measurable than others. So if height is latent, well then IQ is latent as well. So we have an IQ variable here as well. Now, if I were to measure IQ, so I'm going to measure IQ, this measurement is going to tell me something about the IQ, but it's going to be imperfect. When we talk about variables like IQ, nobody has any problems with calling that a latent variable. Okay, so it's unobservable. So you're walking around, you're observing nature, and the argument is that IQ is just not something you can see directly. In other words, it has to be basically inferred based on other variables, based on other observable variables. So variables that are latent, well, they have to be kind of indicated by observed variables. So I think we've mentioned this before. Our classic example is like verbal, quantitative, and analytical. Well, for argument's sake, we're going to call these observable variables. So I can observe your verbal score. I can observe your quantitative score. I can observe your analytical ability by taking measurements, almost like if you're taking like the GRE or something like that. The relations among these variables here and the observing of these variables might indicate some underlying factor, some underlying construct, some underlying variable that I do not have direct access to. This is the idea of the latent variable. So if I have IQ over here, then the argument is that IQ is the thing that's giving rise to these observed variables. Okay, so IQ is giving rise to these observed variables. But based on our talk over here, it doesn't take long to realize that, well, really, verbal is also a latent variable, quantitative is a latent variable, and analytical is a latent variable. But we're treating them as observed just for the sake of this particular model. Okay, so we're trying to make the distinction between latent and observed, and I'm putting forth the argument that pretty much all variables are truly latent when you really think about it, because think about it. If this is verbal, are you observing somebody's verbal ability? No, it's being indicated by something, right? So it's being indicated by what? Well, you could put a whole bunch of different items of the test. Item 1, item 2, item 3. You know, maybe that goes up to like 20 items or whatever, but those items have an underlying ability, or the person answering on those items has an underlying ability called verbal ability. So it's the verbal ability that's giving rise, in that sense, to the performance on the items. The same way that IQ is giving rise to the verbal ability. We can say the same thing for quantitative ability and put like our items here or whatever we're doing. It doesn't even have to be items. It could be like just your observance that the person has good verbal ability. You know, underlying their use of words or underlying Stephen King's like writing, you say, boy, that person has good verbal ability. And then somebody says, how do you know that person has good verbal ability? Because I'm observing manifest variables that suggest there's an underlying theme of verbal ability. Okay, just like I'm observing verbal ability, which suggests there's an underlying theme or construct, latent variable of IQ. So this is the first thing to think about with latent variables and observed variables is, you know, you can distinguish these things until you're completely exhausted, but I think what you're going to find is that variables are best considered to be latent, but some of them are less latent than others, so we treat them as observed. But again, remember this chain here, remember this idea, because then you won't just be a person who just kind of classifies them and just is comfortable with the classification. You realize a little bit more of these issues are not kind of that direct when you really start to break them down. This item here, if this is an item, well, you can think of that too. You say, well, surely that has to be the stop, right? These have to be observable items. Well, not really, because then you could even, if you wanted to, break that down further into maybe behaviors that are producing the item and all of that stuff. So you can almost continue to break that down. Not that anybody really would. They would just consider these things as manifest, as observable. So usually when we talk about things like factor analysis and structural equation modeling, we usually stop the insanity here. We just say, you know what, you got a score in a test. We scored your WAIS test or whatever you're dealing with, and you have a verbal score of 100. We're going to consider that to be observed. But that's context specific. It depends on how you're modeling things. So, but that's a kind of like how it's typically done. Okay. Can you see it? Can you measure it easily? If you can, then it's observed. IQ is how factor analysis got started. Okay. So IQ is Spearman's G factor. This was the kind of complete motivation for factor analysis, saying we can't observe IQ, we can only observe behaviors of IQ. So I think I drew this last time. There's the waters. IQ is down here. It's that latent idea, and that's giving rise to the observed variables. Now that's a different idea Okay, that's a different idea than principal components analysis. So in principal components analysis, what did we say? Well, we had a linear combination, right? A linear combination of observed variables. So in principal components analysis, we said y is equal to ax1 plus ax2, etc., where these are the observed variables, right? These are the observed variables. Now we said we had to choose scalars to weight the observed variables. Well, this idea of PCA is not the same as what we're going to talk about with the factor analysis model. And the distinction is that in PCA, as we've talked about, is an orthogonal transformation. Okay, it's an orthogonal transformation. So you take your variables, you transform them to new axes, right? You transform them to new axes, and there are your components, and that's it. You're weighting the observed variables. Factor analysis proceeds differently, even though they're often kind of lumped together by some writers. You need to understand the distinctions between them because they're not the same, and there's some very, very crucial distinctions between them. So by the end of today, in our talk about factor analysis, what we want to make sure here is that you're aware of these distinctions, that there's about the issues with factor analysis and what it's really doing. So the first thing is to compare it to the PCA model, which we're doing here. So we have the observed variables right here. We have scalars. Now, if you look at this idea is not a principal components idea, because in a factor analysis, it's going to be observed variables that are a function of latent factors. It's going to be observed variables that are a function of latent factors. So I pulled out some notes here that I will post just to get us through some of the technical details, because we have to focus on some of these technical details because this is where the root of factor analysis is really contained, and we need to see this at least once, right? You're not going to be repeating these technical details for the rest of your research careers, but you need to see it so that you're really familiar with what this methodology actually accomplishes and some of the issues with it. So here's what's called the common factor analytic model. Now, the common factor analytic model, the first thing to realize is that it is a model. Okay, so we talk about regression models, we talk about ANOVA models. It's a model. Now, the PCA, the principal components analysis, isn't really a model like this. We sometimes talk about it. We say, well, there's a PCA model, but it's not of the same type. There's some crucial differences. In the PCA, we're just performing a transformation. It's almost like the PCA is, in a sense, it's kind of just like a mechanical transfer of the information onto different axes. The factor analysis is a statistical model. And we're writing out the factor analysis model here, and I'm going to just make reference here to what's in MARE. So last time I talked about this model a little bit in MARE, and this is equation 2.3 on page 26. So this is the model featured in MARE. This notation is just going to differ a little bit, but I'm just going to guide us here as to these equivalencies of notation. They're almost identical. There's not really much of a difference. The first thing here is you have the X. Well, there's the X over here. Now, this particular vector, it's a vector. So there's the vector in there, and here's the vector here. This is a vector of observed variables. Okay, so this is a vector of observed variables. Now, right away, look at the PCA. If there's our PCA, notice there's a difference already. I mean, right from the start, we notice there's a difference. This is a vector of observed variables. What was this? In the PCA, this was going to be the component scores, right? So in James, when they're computing, they called it Z, you're computing component scores over here. So right away, the output of these different procedures is different. They're formulated differently. So the first indication here is that when you look at a book that has factor analysis and principal components analysis as the same procedure, well, you know they're not the same procedure because, first of all, the outcome of their model equations is different. Factor analysis, observed variables. And this makes sense because if you look at here, we're saying observed variables are a function, so equal to, are a function of something, right? So observed variables, verbal, quantitative, and analytical, are a function of something. Well, what are they a function of? Okay, what are they a function of? Well, let's just ignore this because this isn't really important right now. And let's just go to this. Okay, Mayer skips over this mean, and let's just go to this part right here. We got lambda, then we have another vector that corresponds to a vector of unobservable common random factors. So this here is going to be a loading matrix, and this, the F, is what Mayer is calling over here. Those two things are going to be the same. Okay, those are going to be the same. They're just slightly different notation. The equation that Mayer talks about, he talks about it in about 3 lines, right? We're just expanding those 3 lines. So on page 24, it's literally like about 3 or 4 or 5 lines where Mayer unpacks this. We're unpacking it a lot more in here so we really understand what the equation is communicating. So we have observed random variables, a vector of observed random variables. So how many variables you have here? Maybe you have 100, maybe you have 1,000, maybe you have 20. This is a function of unobservable factors, and that's what F is. Weighted by a loading matrix, weighted by a loading matrix. So you're going to have unobservable factors weighted by a loading matrix. And the first question you might ask is, how the heck are we actually modeling observed variables as a function of unobserved variables? Right? Unobserved variables. Well, that's exactly what factor analysis does. Look at PCA. Back to PCA for a second. Did we do anything like that in PCA? We didn't. We just did not do anything like that. Now, you look at the similarities, say, well, we did have a loading. We did have loadings, and that's all right. You can draw that parallel that we had loadings. They're not going to be the same loadings, but you draw the parallel, you say, well, it's kind of similar because we had loadings. But look at the X1, X2, X3, X4, X5. These were observed variables. So principal components analysis produces linear combinations of observed variables, right? Linear combinations of observed variables. Factor analysis models unobserved variables. On the right side are unobservable factors. And that's why this observed versus latent distinction is so important, because we're actually saying the observed is a function of something unobserved. You say, boy, that sounds weird. Well, let's look here. The observed, right? You're observing this, is a function of the unobserved. Okay, so we need some examples to go like, how do you even conceptualize this? Well, we have the IQ example and stuff like that. Here's another recent example, and it's kind of interesting when you start thinking about these types of examples. You find them almost everywhere. I was recently watching the Blair Witch Project. Okay, so again, I had seen it before, but I want to see it again. And if any of you aren't familiar with the Blair Witch Project, I'm sure you've all seen it or heard of it. Go out or get on Netflix or whatever and like watch it. Okay, especially at this time of year, it is like such a scary movie. And I think the combined cost for the movie was like $10. They hardly had to pay anything to make the movie because it doesn't use special effects. It's very, very simple. And it's about these teenagers go out into the woods, and they're in search for, I think it's in search for a witch or something like that. I don't know the full story, but these people go out into the woods and they're following like a legend. story that there's like a witch in the woods, or they want to discover the witch or something like that. So they go into the woods and then they get lost. And I think this is up in Maine or something like that. So they're in a wooded area and they get lost. And, you know, and then their mind starts playing tricks on them and stuff like that. And then they start observing things. So one of the things they observe, like they observe some weird structures in the woods. Like, so here's some wood, and, you know, and they see like little crosses and stuff like that, like a little wooden person like that hanging from a tree. Then they see another wooden person and all this stuff. And just some weird things. Well, these are observable variables, right? You can think of it like that: observable items, observable things. So another weird thing they found in the woods and all that stuff. They also hear some weird sounds, like they hear someone screaming in the background, like far away. And they actually lose one of their friends along the way, so they think it's him, and like a whole bunch of weird stuff is happening. Observable variables. And they ask the question from a factor analytic point of view: what are these observable variables a function of, right? What are all these observable variables a function of? Well, it's certainly something that they cannot see, right? They cannot see it. But the whole idea of the movie, from what I gather, is that there's something latent underneath that's generating the observed variables. And that's where I think they have the idea that there's a witch or something like that that's after them. Something weird is hunting them. Like one of the characters actually says, when she's talking in her camera, she says, "Oh my God, we're actually being hunted by something." But they can't observe it. They just see the observed variables. So you can think of it like that, right? There's something latent going on that's generating the observed variables. It's not a perfect analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but you kind of think, where's the underlying thing that's generating this? Right? Where's the underlying thing that's generating this? You can see how in personality theory, factor analysis can be quite common and useful, because you can think of, you have a whole bunch of different qualities. You think if there's something underlying latent idea that's responsible for this. Well, maybe it's your personality, right? Personality is the underlying latent idea that's giving rise to your particular behaviors. So that's a powerful way of looking at it. Observed is a function of latent. Now in this model here, we're also going to have an error term. So when you start seeing error terms, you start seeing loadings, you start seeing these things, well, you're going to start thinking that this actually looks a little bit like a regression. You start thinking this looks a little bit like regression. Forget about PCA. Doesn't really look like PCA at all. It starts to look like regression. This average here, this mean, which is not in MARE, which is okay, but just to note, this is a mean of vectors of the random variables in X. So it's just an overall mean. Again, MARE leaves it out, and it's not important. It's not the crucial part of factor analysis, but just be aware that that's where this is coming from. This factor analysis model is often written in terms of deviations like this. Again, the side here is what's important that we want to unpack. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to compare these two models right here. We have the factor analytic model, where this is X as a function of the weighted factors plus E, versus the linear regression model. Okay, we reprinted the linear regression model here just to compare them, because as we've noted, PCA is out. This is not really the same as PCA. And in many cases, or kind of like from a statistical point of view, it actually shares a lot of commonality with the regression idea, just because of how we're looking at these weighted ideas. Now, if you look at the comparison, well, in the regression model, this is observed, right? Nowhere in the regression model did we actually have unobserved variables, unless we consider this to be unobserved, which I'll talk about in a second. But this here was an observed vector of variables. Well, factor analysis is not observed, it's unobserved. This is unobserved. F is unobserved. We had beta weights or raw regression weights, whatever we chose to use there. We have that same idea in the factor analysis model. Okay, the order is just a little bit different, but the idea is there. In the regression model, these were observed variables. In the factor analysis model, this is observed. So you can see that there's some parallels here. Now, what's the E? Well, remember in the regression model, error was all that couldn't be predicted based on our systematic component of the model, right? Based on our systematic component, this was everything that couldn't be predicted. And we usually could not observe errors. We could observe the errors, so we computed things like residuals, little e's or little r sub I for residuals. And that's how we kind of thought about that error term. We're going to just extend this idea a little bit here, because in regression, we didn't have to talk about this thing as being a latent variable. In the factor analysis model, it helps to think about this as latent. Now, what do we mean by the error term potentially being a latent variable? Well, in the regression, we compute residuals. Those are differences between the observed minus the predicted, and you get your residual. That's an observable quantity. That's an observable number, like it's 5, 10, 15. It's an observable number. But in the wider model, this here, as I mentioned, can be considered something unobservable. We don't know what the true error is, right? We don't know what the true error is. We're just computing the residuals to try to get a handle on it. In the factor analysis model, we're modeling X as a function of the weighted factors, which again are unobservable. You're figuring how we can actually weight them by unobservable variables. That sounds really strange. We're going to get to that. Plus a latent component here. So the error term here can be considered unobservable, right? It's unobservable. This was always unobservable here as well. It's just that we didn't call it such, because oftentimes in regression, we just don't think of that as being kind of like a latent variable. We don't think of it as being unobservable. We just think of it as being kind of corresponding to the residual more or less. And that it doesn't really correspond to the residual. The residual is just used to get a handle on it. But now we want to widen our thinking about that and think of, you know what, this is really unobservable because you can't observe this. And in the factor analysis model, we have to acknowledge that we can't observe it. So X, the vector of observed variables, is a function of factors, all weighted by some weights, plus all that can't be written as a function of X, right? All that can't be, the non-systematic component of the model. That's the idea of factor analysis. Now, what goes into this E? What goes into this E? Well, what is E made up of? So I'm just going to put E here, and I'm going to pretend that we're going to actually unpack E. Now, you say, how are you going to unpack E? In the regression, we never unpacked it. We just called it the error residual. There was nothing to unpack, or at least we didn't make an emphasis on it. We just said it's just an error. All that can't be predicted. Because we're dealing with latent ideas in the factor analysis model, we're now going to unpack the error term. So what's the error term composed of? What's the error term a function of? So I'm only taking this term and I'm unpacking it. I'm saying what went into that term? Well, let's put some ideas down. E1 plus E2 plus E3 plus so on and so on and so on. Maybe you get to like En. In other words, this error can be said to be composed of a whole bunch of little error terms, right? In other words, a whole bunch of little things contributed to this. A whole bunch of things contributed to this. Now, what are those things? What are those things? Well, you can kind of theorize, and you have to theorize when you get to this stuff, because structural equation modeling even gets a little bit like nuttier than this. And they start making big deals about these error terms. And so you have to theorize a little bit here. We're entering that kind of measurement idea, the psychometric area, where you're saying, you know, why is there an error term? Well, there's an error term because, I don't know, maybe, you know, the person got up earlier in the morning than another person. Therefore, that's contributing to the error term. There's another error term. Maybe it's a sunny day, maybe it's a cloudy day, whole bunch of things. And we actually also have to acknowledge that, you know, somebody's verbal ability, right, cannot be accounted for completely. So in other words, some of these errors could actually just be measurement errors, or even the impossibility of just getting a handle on someone's verbal ability perfectly. And sometimes those things, by structural equation enthusiasts, are called things like random shocks, right? Like just random shocks that you'll never be able to model verbal ability or quantitative or what have you completely as a function of the factors. You're going to have some kind of like unique variance. You're going to have some specific variance associated with trying to get a handle on the X. That's what that unobserved variable is. And the reason why we're calling it unobserved now is because usually we can't see it. Usually we can't see it. Like, how do you see measurement error? Right? You can't see measurement error. You can't see random shocks. You can't see the fact that one person got up earlier in the morning than another, therefore they were sharper, therefore they did better on the test. And this has big connotations of what we think of when we think of test theory and things like that, like measurement theory, that there's an infinite number of factors contributing to that error term. So if we were to think about this from a latent perspective, I would do like an error term. And if I really wanted to, I can say, well, the error term is giving rise to, okay, so notice that this becomes like my little mini factor, like my mini unobserved variable, and that's giving rise to E1, E2, E3, and so on. And that's just unpacking the error term. Now, when we get to looking at structural equation models a little bit, we're interested in what's contained in here. And you might even theorize that the stuff contained in the error term for one factor might be related to the stuff contained for another factor. So for the first time in our modeling, you might actually choose to correlate error terms. And I've put a two-sided arrow here. That's going to indicate correlation. If it was a one-sided, it's going to be like a prediction equation. So X predicts Y. If it's two-sided, that's saying it's basically a correlation. This idea of correlating error terms is brand new. Okay, we've never ever seen that before. And even if you're coming from previous stats courses, you most likely never thought of correlating error terms. And when you think of why we'd want to do that, well, think of it this way. All of these infinite number of little things that are a part of this, right? So the error term is giving rise to a whole bunch of different things that's related to all the different little things for which this is responsible for. So the fact that we're including it in the error term, the fact that this error term exists in the factor analysis idea, and as we go forward to confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation modeling, the theorists in this area say, well, why do we have to treat this as just an error term? You can actually relate these ideas. We don't know what it is. We don't know what's in here. We don't know precisely what's in here because there's too many things. But it seems reasonable that we might be able to relate the error terms. All that's not accounted for here is related to all that's not accounted for here. Okay, so let me just give you an example of how that might work. Where suppose we have say IQ for one generation. Okay, so this is like the parent's IQ. Okay, so IQ for one generation, and then we say IQ for one generation is predicting IQ for the second generation. Okay, and part of the impetus behind these models was trying to account for genetic traits, transfer over generations. So you can see where some of these ideas are coming from, why it was such a big deal to try to model these things in the first place. Well, this IQ is going to have an error associated with it, and this IQ is going to have an error associated with it. So if we think of these error terms are all that's not accounted for here, we might want to relate the error terms. Okay, we might want to relate the error terms. The first generation of IQ, the second generation of IQ, we're not going to be able to predict that perfectly. So all that's unpredicted might actually be relatable. And because it's a generational idea, maybe these error terms actually contain similar information. We don't know what the information is, otherwise we would model it into our system, but it still may be relatable. That's one way of thinking about the error terms as well. So getting back to this, we said that F is a vector of unobserved latent variables, and we said that X is observed. And we'll get back to those error terms and talk a little bit about it here in these particular notes, which again, I'm going to post some of these after today's lecture. That what's contained in the error term, we sometimes call specific variance or error variance. And you can, the structural equation modelers actually unpack the error term a lot more and sometimes call it unique variance and specific and all this stuff. We're not going to do that. We're just going to just call it the error term and just get this appreciation that it's made up of a whole bunch of different things, including measurement error. Okay, there's measurement error, there's random shocks, there's a whole bunch of things in there. So there's a whole bunch of assumptions that have to be made for the factor analytic model. Okay, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that have to be made. And we're not going to run through all these assumptions. You can look in Mayer, you can look in the Stevens book, and they'll talk a little bit more about the assumptions. Many of the assumptions are very, very theoretical. So, you know, I'm going to talk about them briefly here, just for a second. We say that the expected value for the factor is equal to 0. Okay, we say the expected value for the factor is equal to 0. Well, that's set for convenience. Okay, that's set for convenience. So again, this assumption will have really no meaning for us right now. So I'm just kind of glancing over it. I do want to talk a little bit about the fact that it's an orthogonal factor analytic model that we're developing. And when we say it's orthogonal, we say that the factors do not covary. Okay, again, orthogonal and a lack of correlation do not mean the same thing, but in this case, they do. It's orthogonal. It implies that the factors do not covary. So if you have one factor, it's not related to the other, and that's set by the procedure. That's set by the procedure. So when we do ordinary exploratory factor analysis, this is set into motion. You're constraining things so that it's orthogonal. Now that's important because in some other models, you may wish to relax this assumption or this constraint of which you allow the factors to vary, to covary. Okay? But in this case, it's going to be just an orthogonal model. Let's get on with, there's a few more assumptions here and you can look over them. Why are model assumptions important? Well, remember, we have to make assumptions when we go into modeling, right? Whenever we do things like regression analysis, analysis of variance, you have to come into the procedure with assumptions. You're never just looking at the data, and no more true is this in factor analysis, because the factor analysis, in a sense, as we're going to see, is built on these fundamental kind of assuming there's factors, assuming there's things called specific variances and stuff like that. So you're actually entering the modeling framework with these assumptions. Like even the idea of assuming orthogonal factors, well, that's an assumption. You know, we don't know if they're going to be orthogonal. You're setting the model up so that they're orthogonal. So in that sense, that's why you have to start somewhere with the assumptions. Very rarely are researchers ever just looking at data, and sometimes we think about it that way. We think of, you know what, data is data, just look at it. Well, when you model data, you're coming in with all these assumptions. So, you know, if you want to think about this as the eyes one uses to see often plays a significant role in what is seen. And that's true, especially in factor analysis, as we're going to see. It's not just looking at data, it's establishing a model to look at the data. So the factor analytic tool is what you're going to be using to look at the data. So you have to understand a little bit about the eyes that are doing the seeing. It's not enough to just look at the data, and you're going to see why that's so important. Okay, the factor model is an implication for the covariance matrix. So here's some of the technical details that we're just going to start in here before we take a break. And we have to develop this because this is the really, really important part of understanding what factor analysis does. So factor analysis has an implication. So the factor analysis model that we just looked at, well, that factor analysis model implies this particular equation, okay? It implies this particular equation. So that model equation we looked at, we do some work on that equation and we enter our assumptions, right? We enter all those assumptions, you know, that we just kind of glanced over. When you input those assumptions, it implies this. So you think of it almost like an algebraic equivalency that you go from the factor analysis model implies this. Now, what does this say? This says that the covariance matrix, okay, the observed covariance matrix, well, it's observed on your variables, right? So if you have x1, x2, x3, you have a covariance matrix of observed variables. That covariance matrix is a function of the loadings, okay, the loading matrix, there it is there, times its transpose, okay, times its transpose, plus an error variance containing uniqueness, okay, plus an error variance containing uniqueness. So what this says is the factor analysis model on a structural point of view can be reproducing the covariance matrix. This is what factor analysis is actually doing on a technical standpoint, is it's reproducing the best it can the covariance matrix. You can also standardize the covariance matrix to produce the correlation matrix, but for now we're just going to talk about it as being the covariance matrix. Remember that a correlation matrix is a standardized covariance matrix. So the more general term is just saying covariance matrix. Covariance matrix is a function of these loadings plus unique variance. So what this means is you start off with this observed, and you are going to generate a factor theory that you hope, right? You're going to generate a factor theory that you hope reproduces this. Okay, and you know, just pause for a second to think of what that means. You've got the observed covariance matrix. What factor analysis will do is try to reproduce it. There's the reproduction. Now that may sound familiar because that's very similar to what happens in regression analysis. This reproduction, if it's good, right? If it's good, imagine you can completely reproduce the covariance matrix based on your factor analysis procedure. Then you would say, hey, I have a pretty good fit. I have a good fitting model because I was able to actually reproduce the covariance matrix. Why? Because this implication holds. Because this says that the covariance matrix is a function of those factor loadings. Now, why does that sound familiar? Well, it may sound familiar because remember in regression analysis, y sub I, right? There was our response variable. What was the job of regression analysis? When you think about it, why did we produce that regression model? Y is equal to ax plus b, or bx plus a, depending on what symbols we use. I put the intercept over here instead of before it. What did we try to do? What was regression analysis really trying to do? It was actually trying to, in a sense, reproduce the response variable, right? It was trying to reproduce the response variable. So really, this idea here, you know, what did we do in, just to close that idea, look, regression analysis said, here's our predicted value. There's our observed. There's our observed. This is what we reproduce using the factor model. And then what did we do in regression analysis? Well, we did things like we correlated this with this to see what kind of fit we got. And we measure those things in terms of like R squared and adjusted R squared and all those things. Now that fit was never going to be perfect, but hopefully like a linear function of these observed variables existed in the predicted values. So it's like, can you kind of account for the observed information based on your model equation? And maybe we required more than one predictor and we got into multiple regression. But this was the idea. So this idea of factor analysis is not that different when you compare it to the regression model framework. And there is one of the fundamental equations of factor analysis that tells you on a structural basis what's going on. Now, let's just take a quick break. But before the break, we want to talk a little bit about the problems that are going to enter into this reproduction. Because what becomes the technical goal here becomes getting a loading matrix, right? Getting a loading matrix multiplied by its transpose. That's what that says. The loading matrix multiplied by its transpose. It means getting a loading matrix that best approximates this, right? It best approximates the covariance matrix. So forgetting the unique variances here for a second, forgetting these error variances, just because we don't want those, you know, the error variances, we don't really want those. That's kind of like that error component. This is like the heart of it. You want this and this. Oops, that shouldn't be an A. You want, and I just did it again. You want this and you want this to completely regenerate this. Well, what is this? These are loadings. So these are the analogous idea to like regression weights in regression. Only now they're in factor analysis. Now look at this really carefully. These are loadings, but they're not applied to anything. They're not applied to, where are the variables? Where are the observed variables in here? There are none. All we have are loadings. Okay, and that's really, really important to understand, because in the regression framework, when we try to, you know, more or less kind of reproduce that y vector, we did it by putting in observed variables, whether it was one variable or multiple regression, 2, 3, or 4, etc. In the factor analysis model, there are no observed variables. You know, nowhere in here do we have like an X or something like that. We just have loadings. In other words, this covariance matrix in factor analysis is being theorized to be made up of entirely something that doesn't exist, right? Something that doesn't exist for which you're just going to have loadings for. And that is different from the regression model. And it's definitely different from PCA, because in PCA, when we said y is equal to AX, well, that was observed. We have no observed here. All we have are loadings. So to lead us into break, what is going to be the challenge of factor analysis? Well, the challenge of factor analysis is going to be to select a loading matrix, because this is just one loading matrix times itself by its transpose. So you're really just after like getting this loading matrix. Like this is the job of factor analysis, is to get a loading matrix that will best reproduce the covariance matrix. But this loading matrix will not contain observed variables. So the question is how to select this loading matrix. How to select the loading matrix. Because if you can determine how to select that loading matrix, and you're really good at selecting the loading matrix, then you're going to be really good at reproducing the observed covariance matrix, which means you're going to have a good match between the covariance matrix observed and the covariance matrix based on your factor analysis. So let's take a break. We come back and we ask the question again, how do you get that loading matrix, and what makes for a good loading matrix? What is going to make for a good loading matrix right here? That's what we'll talk about. Come back after break. So I'm going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.